Thank you very much. So I give the floor to John Burley, who will present us the book Eric Drummond and His Legacies. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much for this, and thank you to Grace Ells for the opportunity to speak about the book which I co-authored with 3 other British colleagues. In fact, I'm not going to tell you in detail what is in the book. I'm going to talk about Eric Drummond and what happened 100 years ago for the creation of the International Civil Service. In all its essential respects, the International Civil Service, the ISC, dates from the League of Nations. And in that regard, it is the one feature of the League that was not a failure. So I'm going to make 3 short remarks. How, out of the ashes of the First World War, a completely novel entity in international affairs, namely an international administration with executive functions, emerged. Secondly, I recall the basic principles and characteristics of that international administration. And thirdly, I will remind us all of the legacies of the League which transited to the United Nations. 100 years ago, the victorious powers in the Great War accepted Woodrow Wilson's proposals, ideas for an international organization, but there was no consensus at all on the nature of a secretariat which would be necessary to support such a venture. There were, broadly speaking, 2 schools of thought. There was the orthodox view, which was propagated by an influential British civil servant who was secretary of the Paris Conference, Maurice Hankey, who didn't really believe in the League, and who felt that the League should be staffed by diplomats seconded from their national ministries of foreign affairs to the League Secretariat for short periods of time to undertake specific tasks. Fortunately, Maurice Hankey refused the job as the Secretary General of the League. And it went to his subordinate, Eric Drummond, whom the French Premier Georges Clemenceau proposed for appointment as a Secretary General. Drummond was a convinced internationalist. He believed in countries working together to solve common problems. He was probably influenced by something which happened in London towards the end of the First World War, whereby a group of officials from France, from Britain, from Italy, and eventually from America and the United States when they joined the war, who coordinated the best possible use of the maritime transport capacity in the Allied countries, in order to make sure that the right amount of medicine, food supplies, and armaments were transported to the right place at the right time. This was a very successful experiment. It's the first case, I think, of international functional cooperation, and it shortened the war. And many of the senior officials associated with that agreed to join Eric Drummond in setting up the League of Nations Secretariat. That took place over a matter of a few weeks in the summer of 1919. Drummond worked closely with his deputy, whom some of you may know, but it's not generally known, that the eminent Frenchman Jean Monnet, who was the European Union founder, worked on this scheme and was heavily instrumental in the setting up of the League. All this was done without any guidance from governments. They had nothing at all, but it worked well to such an extent that the British Foreign Secretary at the time, Balfour, was able to make a statement at the Council of the League in Rome in May of 1920. The statement was in fact drafted by Eric Drummond himself, and I quote it, "Members of the Secretariat, once appointed, are no longer the servants of the country of which they are the citizens, but become for the time being the servants only of the League of Nations. Their duties are not national but international. Drummond built on this statement, which had the consensus of members of the Council at the time, and set forth the principles under which the Secretariat would function. Before I come to that, I'd like to say something about Eric Drummond himself. He was a Scottish aristocrat from the Perth family, modest and self-effacing. He created, by example, trust in the Secretariat and with member states, because staff from the different nationalities were treated in the same way. They had the same opportunities, and they perceived themselves to be working for the same purposes. Drummond was recognized for his sense of fairness, his careful attention to detail, and his constant hard work. And these qualities allowed him to build up and direct, for 14 years, he's the longest ever serving Secretary General, a permanent international civil service known for its high standards of integrity, impartiality, and efficiency. Now, the essential features of an international administration that Drummond set forth are very familiar to yours, so I can be very brief. The principle of loyalty to the international organization. This doesn't mean foregoing your national identity, but it does mean that strict loyalty to the international interests take precedence. The principle of independence in two respects. First, the obligation for staff not to seek or receive instruction from governments, and the complementary enjoinment on the governments not to seek to influence. And secondly, for that time, the entirely revolutionary notion that an international secretariat is an actor in its own right in international affairs. Then, of course, we have the principle of impartiality, integrity, and objectivity. And finally, the principle of an active and responsive international administration acting solely in the interests of an international community and its internationally agreed standards and obligations. These principles were new for the time. The executive function today is, of course, totally normal, but in those days it was anything but. Now, in contrary to the political and security failures of the League, all other aspects of the League have stood the test of time. So my third point is simply to recall some of those things which the League passed to the UN and to the specialized agencies. In contrast to the covenant of the League, which was silent on the responsibilities of the Secretariat, the UN Charter is much more explicit. Franklin Roosevelt, the US President, was desperate to protect his new world organization against contamination from an association with the League that, as you all know, 25 years earlier, the Senate, US Senate had rejected. So the United States could never publicly recognize what was good about the League. Nevertheless, the Americans in 1945 at San Francisco understood the need for an effective and independent Secretariat, and thus the Charter defines the Secretariat as one of the principal organs of the new United Nations with its own rights and responsibilities. Article 99 of the Charter allows the Secretary General to alert the Security Council on issues of peace and security. This article, in fact, has provided the basis for a proactive Secretariat on a range of issues. That article is drawn directly from the experience of the League and also from Drummond's advice to British officials who were drafting the League. Article 100 of the Charter adopts what Drummond had put in place as regards the independence of the Secretariat and its exclusively international status. Drummond introduced an oath of office for League officials. This was taken over by the UN for UN officials, and the wording is exactly the same. The list could go on and on. The UN structures, its methods of work, the functioning of a secretary and its responsibilities, the staff regulations and rules, including the method of calculation of salary scales, relationships with civil society, importance of public information, and much more, are all based on League precedents. The Manuela Totoya's paper for this dialogue goes into many of these issues. It highlights the seamlessness of the 100-year history of the ICS that is now being commemorated, and we'll hear in a moment more about that. It recalls also the great Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld, who did much to codify and set out the principles on which the ICS could function. In doing so, Hammarskjöld made clear his debt to Drummond. In 1956, he said to the press, and I quote, "In the whole field of international politics, one of the most radical innovations was the creation of an international secretariat as something lifted above all national contexts. I admire the way Eric Drummond gave it body and weight. We have had to repeat the experiment. I personally learned very much from both the difficulties and the principles of the first experiment," and Hammarskjöld repeated the same sentiments in his Oxford lecture of May 1961. In our book, we call the ICS the glue that holds the multilateral system together. We don't say that the ICS in the days of the League was perfect. Then as now, the ICS has fallen short of the highest standards it should always seek to uphold. But our book shows that the strengths and weaknesses inherent in today's international administrations were present also 100 years ago. But let us also remember that Drummond created a new concept entirely from scratch and nurtured it to such an extent that it survived both the terrible leadership of his successor and the political and economic catastrophes of the 1930s and the Second World War. Then as now, the ICS comprised human beings capable of both good and bad. Then as now, senior political appointees were both excellent and disastrous. Then as now, when the principles of the ICS are followed and respected by both governments and staff, the entire world is better off. Then as now, the ICS is no more and no less than what governments want it to be. My concluding remark is that for the sake of humanity, the ICS has to be preserved, protected and defended. If the glue comes unstuck, the whole international system collapses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John Burley, for this very interesting view of Eric Drummond's legacy. I now give the floor to Francesco Pisano, director of the library, the UN library in Geneva, who will present us his project of the 100 years of multilateralism. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. I know many of you, and thank you to, first of all, Grace Else for inviting me again after last year. I feel that every passing year I qualify better for this ensemble of people and colleagues. But I also see young places, young faces. I see a student from the MEIG. I was lecturing there a couple of weeks ago. It's a pleasure to see all of you here. And thank you to the Club de la Presse for having us. I would like to use these 10 minutes I've been given to, 100 years of multilateralism in 10 minutes, you do the maths. So, but we'll do something else. He spoke about the civil service. I would like to talk more about multilateralism and how we came up with this program. So behind me, maybe, you have the website. So you can go there and see a lot of stuff that is going on in this program, why we did this program, what it is for, and what are the activities. This program, we began this program on the first day of International Day of Multilateralism, 24 April 19, and we're going to end it on 15 November 2020, which is the 100 years after the first assembly of the League of Nations back in 1920. And so one thing in parentheses, if you want to hear more about his book and you want to hear his voice explaining this, I know this is being recorded, but it's also on our webcast. The library at UN has a webcast called The Next Page. It's very easy to find on all the normal platforms. It's red, very nice. And he's there speaking more extensively about the book and about this essential figure and how unobserved it has gone over the years. And your survey is very, very telling. It's very, very good stuff. But let me go back to why we decided to do this 100 years of multilateralism, this program. So we wanted, first of all, to celebrate 100 years of multilateralism in Geneva. So Geneva is this incredible anomaly, which is a positive anomaly. It's like, if you do the historic carrot sampling of multilateralism, in Geneva you go down deep and you go down to day one. And there is only another place on earth that I know of that you can mention for that is Silicon Valley, where you can go down to the origin of the IT domain or industry, as we call it today. So that is Geneva for multilateralism. And this is something that will have to be borne in mind when inevitably, my opinion, we will have to discuss what is needed for the future. Because there is a catch in all this, and I will tell you very soon. So number one, celebrate 100 years of 1 century of modern multilateralism in Geneva. You can't do that anywhere else. If you do it in New York, you have to wait another 35 years. So by then, we will be celebrating 135 years of multilateralism. So the second is to inspire through history. Now, there is something that went on in multilateralism, especially in the last 80 years, 70 years, is a sort of departure of historians from the battleground of decision-making and governance. And those who were left on the battleground, taking decisions, negotiating decisions, didn't run after the historians. So President Wilson, when he had to craft the position of the United States vis-à-vis this organization still yet to be born, called the best historians in the country, sat down with them and figured out what were the opportunities and the threats. This hasn't been done consistently through history. So this is the first thing that we wanted to do, is to bring history, not for the pleasure of, which might seem very Geneva and always looking back, you know, we have this, we have had this, etc. No, it's more like taking the history and put it square back under the nose of what you may call in theory global governance. The Twitter version of global governance is much more volatile and much less useful than the one based on history. The third thing, we wanted to make a link. At the end of the 100 years of multilateralism in November 2020, we wanted to put a question that now it is also, with great pleasure, put by the Secretary General. What is the multilateralism that we need for the future? Now, this seems so obvious to ask, but it's not. I'll give you an example. 99% of the sources that you can consult today will talk about the future of multilateralism. We want to talk about the multilateralism of the future. And those are two different vehicles. I may be wrong. History will tell. So in 2020, this program, you go in there, you will see a number of things. But in 2020, just to give you the general direction of this program, in 2019, we started presenting historical facts. The flagship project was our combined exhibition together with the Bottom Foundation on the other side of the lake, and together with us and this ICRC, us being UN Geneva, and the ICRC on this side of the lake. And so we tapped into history. In 2020, we started looking forward. We will involve much more the youth. We have plans with the city of Geneva, the canton of Geneva, a number of partners. In 19 alone, we ran more than 40 events to celebrate history of multilateralism in various formats. And we have plans for as many in 2020, together with, of course, this is not just UN. It's really the international Geneva at play. And then we're going to get also a little bit more Genevan in a way. We have a crowdsourcing project where we go and chase those surviving family members of those that were in the Secretariat at the time of the League of Nations. We're going to use the internet to do that and find them using crowdsourcing activities. And then we try to link it to UN 75. I cannot speak about UN 75 now, we don't have the time, but it's this big initiative to ask the world population, what is the world you want in 2045, and therefore, what is the kind of UN we need to get there? It's a big challenge, and it should be enough to motivate a lot of people. There is a growing discussion going on Multilateralism 100 on social media. So this is also new. There is a lot of social media talking about multilateralism. We wanted to have that word buzz again in the ears of people, because multilateralism has been a word in the past 25 years confined to the circles of people like us who work with the concept. So I want to go faster, and I want to draw some conclusions and take advantage of the role here. But just the key points in 2020 is the combination of efforts we're going to have with the airport. You know that the airport was part of the bid of Geneva. Geneva had fierce competitors in this game to host the Société des Nations. And one of them was Brussels. Another one was Lausanne. And so Geneva said, hey, we can throw an airport in there. And so, and actually then they had to throw the airport in there. And so the airport actually is celebrating 100 years. And so next time you take a flight, do that with moderation. You will see stuff about the 100 years of multilateralism there. And then we're going to have an entire multilateral week, the week of 24 April, which is the second International Day of Multilateralism. And so there we will have a number of events. But I'll let you go on the website. There are various sources. Don't forget the podcast, because the podcast has been designed to advance the conversation on multilateralism. And so just to close, I have 3 minutes. Let me tell you something that I told my students at the University of Geneva. There is this growing self-defeating feeling that multilateralism is under attack. I'm sorry to burst the bubble, but it isn't. Because nationalism, as people call it, hasn't been so low in the world since Westphalia. You know, any historians here can tell you. And so what is that we're noticing is perhaps something different. One is the mismatch between the new expectations of world populations at play in multilateralism. Before, there were nice diplomats with long white socks talking about things that their governments had told them to say. And now you've got, you know, hundreds of millions of people linked on the internet live commenting on things and say, you know, this is what we want. And so that is one mismatch of expectations. So I think we should, let me use 3 minutes to tell you what multilateralism is not and how it gets hit on the head. Number one is not just a diplomatic practice. And this is too often confused by observers. The multilateralism implies a commitment to values, a respect for the rules of the game. And so every time you depart from these values, or you pretend you're respecting the value, but you don't, you put multilateralism similarly under pressure. Actually, you are just cheating. It's not multilateralism under pressure. The rules are clear. The second thing that multilateralism is not a recipe for harmony. It's never been. No one said, take this pill and everybody will love each other. Multilateralism has always been a way to put together compelling national different interests and very often conflicting interests. So it's not harmony. It's not the meditation practice of the international community. And so when you say, you know, you guys were meditating and we still have war, this is a failure of multilateralism, well, a 7th grader could say, no, it's not. The third thing that is not a method to achieve quick results. We live in a time where people measure what's happening in terms of weeks. You know, we've been talking about this for 3 weeks and it hasn't happened yet. Failure of multilateralism. Again, multilateralism is there to guarantee long stability in the long term, so it's an inspirational set of things. Today, the UN is important, whether or not it is reformed, whether or not it takes water, because it's the only place where these principles and values and rules of the game are conserved, enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. So until we have another place, another sort of safe in which these principles are enshrined and protected, we ought to protect the United Nations. It's very simple. It's the only hospital in town. It's not because it's not perfect that we start destroying it. And so this is something that we have to keep in mind as we go to the future. And the future is made essentially of this question. However good or bad, is this formula of multilateralism what we need for the future? And the answer is no. Because the current multilateralism has been designed to support something that we call today globalization. A race of competing national interests combined into something that is sustainable in the medium course. That's how we avoid wars. But going forward, the problems have become global, not national. They're not domestic anymore. And so we need something better. So I think, and I repeat, national is up. Are you sure about that? Because by the numbers, is not up. What you are observing is a transition time between something that has worked, more or less, but it has kept us at peace for 75 years, and what is coming at us. And because we're humans, and we have instincts, we know what's coming at us. We know it when we're 16, Greta and company. We know it when we are grayer, like me, and we know it when you're gray cells, like him. We do know it. So if you look at yourself in the mirror long enough, you will know that it's all a question of what multilateralism we need for the future. Thank you.